Hi, and welcome. My name is Ellen Miller. I'm Pro Bono Manager at the National Immigrant Justice Center, and we are so excited to kick this off. Thanks for your time today as we quickly review what we're going to be doing in our Primeros Pasos, the first steps for new arrival clinic. This is a pro bono training, and we're pre-recording it so we can be ready the day of. I'm going to go through just the first couple slides here. We can advance to the next slide. And today we'll be, we'll do a few introductions. We'll talk about the background in immigration 101, first steps in determining what is the procedural posture of the people that we're seeing. So our new neighbors are coming to Chicago. They're arriving in a variety of legal postures, and we need to help them determine where they are at in their legal process so that they know what is also their next steps. We'll look for other issues. We'll definitely talk about clinic logistics, so you're ready to step onto the ground and get rolling. And then any final logistical notes we'll also cover. Before we do that, though, I do want to tell you just a brief bit about the National Immigrant Justice Center. We are a nonprofit legal services provider based largely in Chicago. We also have a large policy team in Washington, D.C. We have 2 offices in Indiana, with a growing team serving the Indiana communities. We have a small office in San Diego, but really our headquarters and our main staff of about 130 are located in Chicago. We have an integral service model that blends national, local advocacy and education. So we have some immigration policy review, looking at what's going on with our policymakers, our legislators, our decision makers, and holding them accountable and helping them to make smart, better decisions for our community and for our immigration system. We also work in federal impact litigation. So what are the macro laws and policies, and how are they applying to the people, and how are they upholding the justice in our federal courts? And then we also, the bulk of our pro bono services are held in our legal services teams. We are able to serve 10,000 non-citizen clients every year. And we do this with the assistance and only with the assistance of our 2,000 pro bono attorneys, legal staff, and language service providers. So we're really excited to be working with you today and forwarding our mission to connect clients with counsel to ensure access to justice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. Oh, I'm not actually. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our pro bono opportunities. So if you enjoyed today's experience, if you're called to serve more the immigrant populations, if you come from an immigrant family yourself or want to make sure our new neighbors have legal stability, there are ways to do that. We have a large, robust asylum program. There's significant need for full representation in our asylum system, working with adults, families, kids, detained immigrants, LGBT folk from around the world, over 87 different countries. With our large law firms and corporate in-house teams, we are hosting individual clinics that include DACA clinics, DACA renewal, naturalization or citizenship, and then working with asylees and refugees and their next steps towards legal stability, which includes family petitions and adjustment of status or their green cards. We are also hosting a number of pro se workshops now with our Afghan populations and our recent arrivals. If your firm is interested in this, reach out to me and we can talk more. We also have special immigrant juveniles. We're supporting our immigrant youth as they take steps towards legal stability in the state court system. And then last but not least, we're working with VAWA and U visas. So those that have survived, immigrant survivors of crimes committed here in the United States or survivors of domestic violence. Like I said, there's lots of opportunities to get involved, and more so, there's a lot of need for pro bono counsel. So thanks for stepping up today, and we look forward to working with you. Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Koop, who will walk you through the situation we're seeing with newly arrived migrants in Chicago. Thanks.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Koop. I'm the National Director of Legal Services at NIJC, and we are so grateful for your willingness to step in and provide these critical services to our new neighbors, recently arrived migrants who have come mostly from the southern border and have made their home, whether that's temporary or permanent, here in Chicago. So since about late August of last year, about 19,000 new arrivals have reached Chicago. And unlike prior populations of migrants who have come to Chicago, this is a group that oftentimes does networks of support through which they can receive food and medical support and so forth while they are figuring out their immigration status. So this is sort of a unique situation for those of us in the legal community to figure out how best to support these recent arrivals, many of whom are coming from distressing situations, have experienced trauma, have survived persecution, and are really looking to stabilize their lives and figure out how to stay in compliance with their immigration requirements so they can hopefully move towards more permanent immigration benefits. You can go to the next slide. So in terms of our local response, the city and the state have collaborated to set up resources for recently arrived migrants and hopefully create increasingly ways for them to be safe, to be housed. But there remains this, the legal services gap, especially as a lot of recent arrivals have moved from shelter to shelter, or they've stayed at police stations temporarily, or they've lived with a friend or family member for some time. But there have been a lot of transitions and a lot of work towards getting families stabilized. And one piece that is so critically important is making sure people understand their immigration legal status and their obligations in order to avoid running into trouble with the immigration system and positioning themselves to hopefully move towards permanent status. So we can go to the next slide. But the aim of this project is to respond to those individuals, to the most recently arrived migrants who are to some degree in a fog of information, and maybe they had some sort of know your rights information that they received on the border, but by the time they've arrived in Chicago, they oftentimes are in critical need to understand what are their rights, what are their options, and how do they make decisions, informed decisions about what to do next. And so through this partnership between the National Immigrant Justice Center and our partner firms, including Kirkland and Ellis, which is co-hosting this training with us, we are excited to pilot this program of Primeros Pasos, or first steps clinics, that are intended to respond to those very first questions that people have when they arrive in our city and help them take steps in order to keep their information up to date and, again, figure out how to move forward with their immigration legal cases. We can go to the next slide. So at these clinics, which conceptually are sort of like a triage clinic, the idea is for people to be able to attend, and maybe they have very limited understanding of their immigration situation when they arrive. Maybe they've been living at a police station, maybe they've been at a shelter, maybe they've been bouncing between the two. The idea is for them to be able to come to this event and receive accurate, reliable information about their immigration case. And so the idea is to provide know your rights information, help them understand what the range of decisions are that they need to make, but then also making sure that the nuts and bolts are taken care of. So making sure that their address is up to date with the various immigration entities that need to be able to reach them. Making sure that if they have an ICE check-in appointment, so ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and many people are required to visit a check-in with ICE in order to make sure they stay in compliance with their immigration requirements. And we want to make sure that people know how to do that if they've been instructed to do so. And then for people that may be seeking asylum, this clinic, this triage event will help them sign up for asylum support so that if they wish to apply for asylum, they're placed on a path in order to be able to do so. And then we'll also be directing participants to other resources to help them move forward with their cases. You can go to the next slide. So let's do a little bit of zooming out on Immigration 101 so that you have a bit of an understanding of what are these entities and what are these obligations that we're referring to. So our immigration system in the United States is really divided between two major agencies. The Department of Homeland Security, which was created in 2001, is an entity that has three immigration components. So there's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which I just mentioned, and ICE is sort of the enforcement branch of the Immigration Service. And then there's United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, They're the benefits people. So this is the entity that should be issuing employment authorization. In some instances, this is the entity that hears asylum cases that are not before the immigration court. And this is an entity where anyone filing an application for most forms of relief will be sending it into USCIS. And then there's CBP, which is mostly out of the picture by the time people are arriving in Chicago, but that's the Border Patrol. And so there is a CBP office in Chicago, but largely by the time you're meeting the migrants who have come to Chicago, we'll mostly be looking at ICE and USCIS under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, separately, the Department of Justice houses the Immigration Court. So we call that the Executive Office for Immigration Review. You might hear us call it EOR or EOIR, and that's where the immigration courts are. So anybody that has to go before an immigration judge is appearing before the Department of Justice. Now, you can probably understand that someone receiving all these different acronyms and guidance from all of these different entities might be pretty confused about who to communicate with about what. And the reality is, for most migrants, they need to make sure that their information is up to date with all of them, with ICE, with USCIS, and with the Immigration Court, if their case is in removal proceedings before the Executive Office for Immigration Review. Let's go to the next slide. So you've already heard me using some acronyms. Let's just run through them so you have some familiarity. This might be a handy slide to keep with you moving forward, so you have a reference guide to these terms. But the A number is a 9-digit identification number that every individual that's had contact with the Department of Homeland Security at some point will have been assigned. This is a really key important number, and we recommend that migrants memorize this number so that anytime they need to check on their status or look up their case, they've got it ready. So it appears on pretty much any paperwork that they've got that's specific to them. So if they're named on it, if it's issued by the Department of Homeland Security, if it's issued by the Department of Justice, it will almost always list their A number. And this is a really important number for them to keep track of. And oftentimes you can help people. By the time you meet them, they may still not be aware of what this number is or where to find it. And so looking at their papers and saying, hey, this is your A number, this is this identification number that you're going to carry through with you for the duration of your case, is an important piece of information for them to have. The NTA, the notice to appear, is a charging document. So even though it sounds like this is like a court notice or a scheduling notice of some sort, the NTA is actually a charging document. So it's more than just the document that tells you when and where to go to court, although it should contain that information. The NTA contains what are the charges under the law that suggest that you can be removed from the United States or deported from the United States. So it lists basic information about the individual, their country of origin, their date of entry, and then the charge under the immigration and nationality law that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, if they're the one that issued the NTA, and they usually are, but whatever government entity issued the NTA will list the charge of removability on that NTA. So this is another important document. If you see an NTA in someone's packet, it means there's a pretty good chance that they either are already in removal proceedings or they could be in the very near future. CBP-1 is an app, a cell phone app that the government created in order to, it's intended to be a scheduling system. So people traveling towards the southern border can, in an orderly fashion, schedule a time to appear at the port of entry and enter the United States with having already shared information about themselves with the US government. The problem is CBP-1 is super duper glitchy. It's really hard to access. A lot of migrants coming north don't have cell phones or don't have cell phones equipped to handle CBP-1. CBP-1 isn't great about capturing information about non-white people. And CBP-1 is just an overwhelmed system. And so all of the people that are requesting appointments at the border through CBP-1, the majority are unable to get them. So you may see some people that have entered the United States using CBP-1. Many others will have entered without using the app. And you'll see that there are distinctions in the types of benefits people get when they enter, whether they entered with CBP-1, which is the preferred method for people to enter the United States, or whether or not they presented themselves at the border without having scheduled an appointment through the app, or whether they entered the United States between ports of entry. So knowing what CBP-1 is, and when people talk about the application that they use to try and schedule their appointment, that's what they're referring to. Parole is one of the ways that officials at the border can release a migrant from immigration custody into the interior of the United States. We like to see parole because if someone has parole, if they have a document that says you have been issued parole into the United States, that means they might be eligible for employment authorization, and that's huge. The next one, the next term below is the EAD, that ever important employment authorization document. People that are given parole can file an application with USCIS saying, hey, I've got 2 years of parole. I would like to have employment authorization based on that parole. And they're eligible to receive employment authorization for the duration of the parole. The problem that we're seeing is at the southern border right now, most people who are not entering using the CBP-1 are not being given parole. They're entering on what's called their own recognizance, or OR. So if you see a document that someone has received that says they've entered on their own recognizance, it'll probably even specifically say on it, not eligible for employment authorization. So that's not great. We want people to be eligible for employment authorization because that's what they need to move out of the shelters, move out of the police stations, get stabilized, and get to a place where they can make informed, good decisions about how to proceed with their cases. Immigration court proceedings. Those proceedings before EOIR. So if someone is in immigration court proceedings, they are either in removal proceedings, which are sometimes called deportation proceedings. And those words can be used interchangeably, deportation and removal. Way back, there's a legal distinction, but for our purposes, using removal and deportation interchangeably is fine. So those are kind of the terms that you should keep in mind as we discuss the universe of issues that may come up at the Primeros Pasos clinics. We can go to the next slide. All right, so considering the people who you will be meeting at this clinic, bear in mind that there will be a range of individuals. There will be a lot of people from Venezuela. We're seeing people from Colombia, from Ecuador. You may see people from Haiti. You may see people from a range of countries. Again, the highest percentage that we're seeing among this recently arrived demographic is Venezuelan, but you're likely, again, to see a range. But you'll also see a range of people within that demographic. So some people will have had significant education. Some may already be lawyers or doctors and be pretty savvy when they come and meet with you. But there are others who maybe never had the opportunity to access education. You're going to meet survivors of trauma. You're going to meet asylum seekers who fled their countries of origin because they've been harmed or they fear being harmed in the future. And you're going to see a lot of people that have really endured a difficult journey. So most of them will have crossed that Darien Gap and will have struggled mightily for weeks, if not months, to make their way to the United States. And so by the time you're meeting them, they've been through a lot. So be aware that one, they'll be incredibly grateful to sit down with an attorney and have someone who can finally explain to them what is going on with their cases. So I think you'll encounter a lot of gratitude, a lot of appreciation. You'll also find people who are pretty intimidated by you. So bear that in mind. Do the little rapport building things to make people feel comfortable, to greet them, to welcome them. Be careful that a lot of the things that we would say and do just in the course of making small talk could raise up some issues for the people that we're meeting with. So when you're asking someone, how do you like the weather in Chicago? This may be someone who's had to sleep out on a sidewalk in the cold. And so thinking about some of those difficulties will be important as you try to connect, during this small slice of time that you'll be meeting with an individual. Think about the ways that you can help them feel human and feel welcomed and feel appreciated, and make sure that they're in the best space to receive the information that we're sharing with them. We can go to the next slide. All right, so, and we can hop on to the next one. Let's try to figure out what the procedural posture is. So again, this clinic, when you show up, when you volunteer, you will have scripts, you will have guidance, you will have all sorts of information to equip you to do this and to make these determinations. But just to give you an overview of the types of things that you will see, this is a picture of that notice to appear. So that charging document that I was describing that talks about, the status of someone's immigration case and why the government believes that they should be why they can be removed from the United States. So it lists that charge midway down the page that talks about what makes the individual removable. Now, what's kind of tricky about the notice to appear is it seems like you should be able to see this document in someone's packet and say, aha, this person is in removal proceedings. Now I'm going to tell them how to proceed with their court case. But what happens in many, many instances is people are issued this notice to appear by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or even by CBP, or sometimes by USCIS, by some component of the Department of Homeland Security. But unless this document is filed with the immigration court, the person is not technically in removal proceedings yet. So they may be, and at any moment, the Department of Homeland Security could file this document with the immigration court, but until they actually file it, the individual is not in removal proceedings. And this is really disconcerting because you'll see at the bottom of the page, it will most often list the time and location of an immigration court hearing. So there will be a date that says you have court before the Chicago Immigration Court on X date. But in reality, unless that notice to appear has been filed with the Executive Office for Immigration Review, that's not actually a court date. So this is a source of significant distress for people thinking they have court dates. And oftentimes it's not actually a court date because the NTA hasn't been filed with the court yet. But if DHS decides to file the notice to appear, then it could become a court date that they have to attend. And the penalty for missing a court date before the immigration court is an in absentia removal order. So we want people to err on the side of caution and make sure that they're not missing court dates. And so one way that they can do that is by checking whether or not their notice to appear has actually been filed in the immigration court. And this is probably one of the most important things that you'll do with individuals when they appear before you. And that is navigating to this website that is a part of Executive Office for Immigration Review. And we'll have links for you to find all of these websites when you're sitting down at stations and working with migrants. But when you get to this website, you can enter that A number. Remember the 9-digit number that we talked about as being so critical and important. You enter that A number into this EOIR portal, and it will reveal whether or not the person is scheduled for an immigration court hearing, or it may say this number is not in the system. If it says the number is not in the system, that means that NTA hasn't been filed yet and the person doesn't actually have a court date yet. Now, if someone doesn't have access to the internet in order to use that online portal, there's a 1-800 number listed below on this slide that they can call to check on the status of their immigration court case. So it's available in English and in Spanish, and people can call and again enter. It's fully automated. They don't have to talk to a live person, but they call the number, they enter their A number, and it will say whether or not your case is in the system or if it's not. And it might say, if it says it's not, you're not in the system, no court date yet. If it is in the system, it will tell you the date and location of court. Now, we recommend that migrants check either that portal or that 1-800 number at least every 2 weeks, so that in the event the NTA gets filed with the court, they don't miss a court date. Because sometimes when that NTA gets filed, that court date is upon us pretty quickly, and we want to make sure that people are going to court if they need to go to court, so they're not missing a court date and risking an in absentia order of removal. We can go to the next slide. All right. So there will be in the packet a document that you will be able to share with migrants that walks them through how to use that 1-800 number in order to check whether or not they are in removal proceedings. So for those who are able to read and have phones, this will be a useful resource. There will also be documents that have that link to the EOIR portal so that people can, in our experience, many of the migrants have cell phones and are able to access the internet. And so if they can use that in order to check their immigration court status. Can go to the next one. All right, so this is just a review of what we've already discussed, that checking that 1-800 number in the system. And this document here on the left, this actually is an immigration court notice. So this is not a notice to appear. This is an immigration court notice. So that's a different document. But this notice says, hey, you have an immigration court hearing at this time and place. And this, if you see this sort of document, that's a very clear indication that the person is scheduled for immigration court, because this is issued by the Department of Justice Executive Office for Immigration Review. And remember, that's where the immigration courts are housed. So if they're the ones issuing this document, then this is telling someone that they have an immigration court hearing. And we can go on to the next slide, although I'll comment just as we're doing that a lot of migrants will have confusion between those ICE check-in appointments that we talked about and immigration court hearings. So you may encounter encounter people who, when they meet you, say, oh, I'm so concerned because I know I have a court hearing on this day. And as you sift through the papers, you might say, oh, here's an ICE check-in notice, but I'm not seeing a court notice. And then if you run their A number in the system, it may reveal that there is no, that their notice to appear has not been filed with the immigration court yet. If that's the case, then what they're thinking of is their ICE check-in appointment, which is also important and also something they need to tend to, but it is not critical in the way that making sure one attends an immigration court hearing is. So when people have a case before the immigration court, it's incredibly important that their address stay up to date with the immigration court, because papers like we saw on the last slide are oftentimes the best way for people to know when they have an immigration court hearing. So checking that portal, checking that 1-800 number, that's always important. That can tell you the time and date of the immigration court hearing. Having your address up to date with the court means that when they send out that paper notice telling you when to appear in court, you'll receive that. So we change our address with the immigration court through a form called the E33, and that form is available online. And so this is one of the things that you may be doing at the clinic, where you'll be sitting down with people and helping them update their address with EOIR, with the Executive Office for Immigration Review, in order to make sure that they are receiving any court notice that is coming to them. So anytime someone moves, even though they may be moving a lot, they need to update their address. And it will be so important to provide this service at the upcoming clinic, and to also give people the tools to change their address on their own, so that if they move after they've attended our clinic, they have the tools to update their address and make sure that they are continuing to receive all of their notices and communication from the government. Now, if someone is in immigration court proceedings, it is possible those proceedings will have been set before an immigration court that is not in Chicago. Now, this may be the case if someone at the border said, hey, I'm going to go live in Miami, or I'm going to go live in Utah, wherever it is. The government, when they filed that notice to appear, may have filed it with a court in that different location, expecting the migrant to go to that city. We have seen people who were living in New York and heard, hey, Chicago's a good place where I should go. And so there are people that maybe started their cases in New York and have relocated to Chicago. For those individuals, in addition to filing that E33 and updating their address with the immigration court, they need to formally file a motion to change venue. So just changing your address with the court doesn't change the venue of the court proceeding. You'll get your notices of your proceeding at your new address, but if that is still venued in New York, you'll be getting your notices about your New York hearing unless you file a motion to change venue. So helping people file pro se changes of venue will be another service that we'll be providing at this clinic, to make sure that people have court in the location where they reside and are not having to travel across the country to a distant location in order to avoid that in absentia removal order. We can go ahead. So on that immigration court notice, it was really tiny, but you could kind of see up at the top that it indicated what type of hearing the individual had. And there are two types of immigration court hearings that you might see. The first is a master calendar hearing, and the second is a merits hearing, or an individual hearing. The master calendar hearing is most likely, if this is a first or second hearing, most likely an individual will be scheduled for a master calendar hearing, which is a status hearing where you go in and you talk to the judge about your case, and maybe you say, hey, I need time to find an attorney, or hey, I'd like to apply for asylum. You might respond to the charges on that notice to appear, that charging document that we talked about. But oftentimes you're doing sort of preliminary activity and informing the court of how you wish to proceed with your case. The merits hearing, or the individual hearing, is the trial. This is when an individual has either filed for some form of relief or requested a benefit or a type of protection from the court. And this is the hearing where the migrant puts on all of their evidence, presents their case, and oftentimes receives a final adjudication from the immigration court. So the distinction there is pretty critical. That said, if you miss either of those hearings, a master calendar hearing or a merits hearing, the penalty is an in absentia order of removal. It is critical that people attend every immigration court hearing that they have, and that includes children. If there are children listed on the case with their parent, those children must also attend the court hearing. And unless the immigration judge has waived their presence, they have to be there. And so stressing to our participants the importance of attending court hearings is a critical service that we'll be providing. Now, there's no right to appointed counsel in immigration court. People will not have attorneys unless they can find a pro bono attorney. You heard Ellen reference pro bono opportunities through the National Immigrant Justice Center at the outset of this. Or if they can hire a private attorney to represent them. So that's a critical need that this group will present. Again, the purpose of this clinic is to give people information, help them move forward with their cases. We won't be making final assessments about what type of case they should present in court, or really walking them through the nuts and bolts of what will happen in the immigration court. Again, people should continue to check that EOIR system. We can't say that enough, either through that online portal or that 1-800 number, at least every 2 weeks, to make sure they're not missing that court hearing. We can go to the next slide. All right, so we talked about the difference between the ICE check-in and the immigration court hearing. If you see a document that looks like this one, that suggests the individual has been told to check in with ICE. Sometimes they will have a specific time and place where they've been instructed to check in with ICE, and a check-in with ICE is different from court. This is where if you actually have the check-in, you go in, you confirm your address with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Again, you're not going before an immigration judge, you're going before Immigration and Customs Enforcement. If they haven't already issued you that notice to appear, they might give you that charging document at your ICE appointment. So the things that happen there are basically individuals are confirmed to be in compliance with ICE. So they're not absconding. They're showing up for these ICE appointments to prove that they're living where they said they were going to live, and they're remaining in compliance. And so if you see something that looks like this, something that's telling someone that they have an ICE appointment, that's what we're talking about. And one of the things, we can move to the next slide, one of the things that we'll be doing is helping people update their address. So if they, again, said, hey, I'm going to Miami, when they were released at the border, they might have a document that says you are instructed to report to ICE within 60 days of arriving in Miami. Well, if they're living in Chicago now, they're not required to travel all the way to Miami for that ICE check-in appointment. They are required to update ICE as to their address and to complete the equivalent of an ICE check-in with ICE Chicago. So if they're staying in Chicago, and this is a document, what you're seeing here on this slide is a document that will be available to our participants in Spanish and English, but it talks about how to make sure that you've completed the requirements of the ICE check-in, either by sending an email to the ICE office in Chicago that tells ICE, hey, I know that you thought I was living in Miami. Now I'm living here. This is my address. These are my family members. This is my phone number. And then that will usually suffice as an ICE check-in if you send in that email. And so many of your participants will have email accounts and email addresses. And one of the ways that we might help them with their ICE check-in is by helping them to send an email into ICE. Now, for people that expect to go somewhere else and would like to schedule their check-in, say in Indianapolis or Milwaukee or some other place, they may use that ICE check-in portal, which is another link at the bottom of the document here, in order to indicate where they will be living. They can update their address, and they can schedule a check-in appointment with a different ICE office if it's someplace other than Chicago. All right, so this is another thing that we'll be helping with at the clinic. And if we haven't already introduced enough different ways to change your address, there is the USCIS change of address form. So again, USCIS is that benefits branch of the Department of Homeland Security, which is different from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And even though they're both a part of the Department of Homeland Security, and you would think that changing your address with one would suffice for changing it with the other, That is not the case. And in reality, people must also change their address with USCIS. Now, this is something that can happen online through this form AR11, where participants who have an email address are able to complete the process online. If someone doesn't have an email address, they will need to do a paper filing of their AR11, and we'll have those materials available at the clinic in the event you need to do a paper filing. But if it's possible to do the filing online because the individual has an email address, that's probably the better way to inform USCIS. And again, the importance of updating the address with USCIS is because that is the address they will use to send documentation. So for example, we talked about people who maybe are eligible for employment authorization based on parole. When they file that application for their employment authorization, the address on that application is the address where USCIS will send that ever important work authorization card unless it's been updated through the AR11. So if someone moves and doesn't update their address, that employment card is going to go to the old address and may be lost forever. And it's incredibly difficult to get an employment authorization card reissued. And so we really want to stress for people, for our participants, that they need to make sure that their address with USCIS stays up to date in order to avoid those sorts of challenges. We can go to the next slide. All right, other issues. And this is where I hand it over to Ashley Hebner, Pro Bono Manager at Kirkland & Ellis.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Hebner. I'm one of the pro bono counsels at Kirkland & Ellis based in Chicago. Before joining Kirkland, I spent many years at the National Immigrant Justice Center. And so I have been thrilled to be able to collaborate with NIJC and with Maria Kutnick at Winston & Strawn to put together this clinic that we think is really critical to respond to some of these initial first step issues that many of the newly arrived migrants are experiencing and need assistance with in Chicago. So I'm going to touch base on a couple issues that may or may not come up when you're talking to the migrants at the clinic, but we want you to have this background information, understanding that while we are going to be discussing these first step issues, the migrants may have many other questions for you. And so we want to be able to give you that information to help manage their expectations about what you can and cannot assist with as they move forward. So one of the most critical issues and concerns for many of the newly arrived migrants, and that you are likely to hear about during the clinic, is the question of work permits or employment authorization documents, otherwise known as EADs. This is one of the most urgent issues that many of the migrants will have because they want to be able to work so they can support themselves, so they can move out of the police stations and shelters and provide for themselves and their families. However, in the U.S. immigration system, getting a work permit, becoming eligible for a work permit can be very difficult and is not actually available to many individuals who are undocumented in this country. For purposes of the newly arrived migrants, there are 3 different ways that many of them may be eligible for a work permit. One is through asylum, if they are eligible to seek asylum and they file an asylum application. One is through parole, as Lisa talked about before, individuals who are paroled into the United States and have that parole for a certain period of time are eligible to apply for a work permit. And if they have temporary protected status or apply for temporary protected status. We are going to talk about TPS and asylum in a little bit greater detail in just a moment, but those are the 3 main ways that individuals would potentially be eligible if they're a newly arrived migrant. We really want to manage the expectations of the migrants. We are not able to assist them with applying for a work permit at the clinic in most cases. Although we hope that in the very near future, these clinics are going to expand to a much larger scale and that there will be work permit clinics affiliated with those clinics. That is not something that we're going to be able to do initially. So this particular slide may change in the future, but right now that's not something we're able to do. And so we want to be very clear that this clinic is to assist with first steps. We understand that work permits are incredibly important and of great concern to the migrants. We can potentially provide some referrals for other resources for work permits, but right now this clinic is assisting with these first steps so that these issues, the question of an immigration court hearing, the question of an address, doesn't create bigger problems in the future that could actually compromise their ability to get a work permit. Immigration options. So there may be questions from the migrants with whom you meet about whether they are eligible for any form of immigration status. They may also have experience with other individuals, friends, relatives, individuals that they've encountered at the shelters or at the police stations who have told them that they applied for this particular form of immigration relief and it gave them some benefit. And they may think for that reason they should apply too, or they have the right to apply to. So again, we want to emphasize and manage expectations that we are not going to be applying for any immigration benefits at this particular clinic. It's important to remember that everyone's immigration case is different. So just because a migrant knows a friend or a relative or someone else who seems similar to them and was able to get a particular immigration benefit, that may not be the same benefit that is available to them. However, there are two options that may be available to some of the newly arrived migrants. The first one, again, is asylum, which we mentioned in the last slide, and the second is temporary protected status, which is particularly going to be available for some of the newly arrived migrants from Venezuela. So I'm going to move to that, and we'll talk about those two different forms of relief very briefly. So asylum is a form of immigration protection, immigration status for individuals who have been persecuted in their home countries because of a characteristic, a personal characteristic about themselves that either they cannot change or they should not require to change. So someone who has been persecuted because of their political opinion or because of their gender, for example, in a gender violence or domestic violence situation, somebody who's being targeted because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, those can all be a basis for asylum under US asylum law. If a migrant has applied for asylum, they will receive something called a receipt notice, which you can make out in this slightly blurry state here. This receipt notice will say in the upper left-hand corner, Form I-589, which is the application for asylum. If a migrant has a receipt notice that says that, that indicates that they have already applied for asylum, which is great. That means that they may be eligible to apply for a work permit already or in the near future, and it means that they don't need to register for a pro se asylum workshop, which is one of the benefits that can be provided at the clinic. If a migrant has not applied for asylum, and they would like to seek asylum, then they may be eligible to register for an NIJC Pro Se Asylum Workshop. That's going to be an option that can happen at the clinic, and there'll be more information about that in the clinic materials. Temporary protected status is a form of temporary permission to stay in the United States that when the Department of Homeland Security has designated a country as being eligible for temporary protected status. And usually it's due to specific conditions in those countries, either war or some kind of natural disaster like an earthquake or a hurricane, something similar to that. When you apply for temporary protected status and get temporary protected status, you are allowed to remain here for a specific period of time. TPS always has a designated period, and you are also able to get a work permit. Your eligibility for TPS depends on your country of nationality or citizenship because it is country-based, and it also depends on your entry date to the United States. So for Haiti, for example, in order to be eligible for TPS as it exists for Haiti right now, you had to have arrived by November 6th of 2022. For Venezuela, this date is incorrect here, but you had to have arrived by July 31st of this year. And so individuals who meet that criteria can potentially be eligible for TPS, which again can be really important to provide that temporary status and that work permit. We hope and we believe that in the very near future, there are going to be mass large-scale TPS clinics to help newly arrived migrants, especially Venezuelans, apply for TPS, and that they will be eligible to register for those clinics via the first steps, the Pasos clinic that you will be participating in. It doesn't exist at this moment, but we hope that will be ready in the very near future. All right, we're now going to run through clinic logistics very quickly. We really just want to emphasize again and again that this is a pilot. We are trying this out. We hope that this will turn into something that can really be done on a large scale basis for potentially hundreds of migrants at a time. But initially, we're going to do this at a small scale to see what works, to see where the kinks are, to see where the glitches are, and to work these things out. So we appreciate your patience. We're going to provide this brief overview right now, but as Lisa said, everybody will also be receiving a detailed script that will walk them through step by step of what questions to ask, what forms to use, what information to enter at each aspect of the clinic that volunteers will participate in. So the clinic's going to begin with a half an hour or so of a video screening where the migrants will be able to watch Know Your Rights videos on several different important immigration topics. Some of them may have already received a Know Your Rights presentation, but this will be a way to reorient them to what's going to happen at the clinic and the basic information, including the immigration court system and the notice to appear. Many of the same things that you were trained on today, they will receive information about that as well. While the migrants are receiving their Know Your Rights videos, then attorneys are also going to get set up in their stations and receive a brief orientation as well. After that, for the next few hours, attorneys are going to be put into stations that migrants are going to cycle through to get assistance on each of the topics that Lisa talked about earlier. The goal for this particular clinic is for migrants to complete the exit station by about 12:30 for the morning shift and by about 4 p.m. for the afternoon shift. Again, we are working out the timing. It may not be as exact or precise as this on the day of, but that's the goal here. And again, each station is going to have a script which all attorneys will receive in advance of the clinic. So the first station, and probably the most important one, is going to be a triage station. Here is where our attorney volunteers are going to help the migrant really situate themselves in the immigration process to determine whether they are in deportation proceedings at this time. So whether that notice to appear has been filed with the court, whether when you call the 1-800 number or go to that online system, it says you're in proceedings and you have a hearing. And then to determine what changes of address are needed and whether a change of venue is needed. So some migrants may only need to change their address with USCIS and with the immigration court and with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Some migrants may need to do all of that and also apply for a change of venue. Some migrants may also need to request a change in location for their ICE check-in. So we want to figure out what services they need, and we want to make sure the migrants understand their procedural posture and also know how to check these statuses themselves in the future. Because again, understanding whether or not they are in court proceedings is absolutely critical and a foundation for their immigration case moving forward. And so we want every single step of the way to make sure they understand that process. So at the triage station, attorneys are going to review the documents that the migrants have to help figure out their procedural posture, check that online system to determine if they are in the immigration court process. There's going to be a checklist that the attorneys are going to complete at this stage, so it's very clear what station assistance is necessary. And they're going to ask if the migrants would like to apply for asylum, because if they do, we will be able to help them register for the NIJC Pro Se Asylum Workshop. There's going to be an immigration court station where a volunteer attorney is going to help the migrants change their address with court, and then if necessary, help them file a motion to change venue. This is going to be pro se assistance. No attorneys will be entering their appearances, but the attorneys will be helping them complete the paperwork, complete the online system, get everything in order, and making sure that the migrants have a copy of the documents that are being filed on their behalf so that they are able to maintain their own record of what's happened in their immigration court case. Again, this is all going to be based on a script and templates. There is no reinventing the wheel, nothing you have to develop from scratch, mostly just filling in the blank and filling out online forms. There's also going to be an ICE change of address station, again, changing the address for the migrants with ICE, and if necessary, changing the location of their check-in appointment. As Lisa said, this is primarily done via email and possibly through ICE's online portal. For many of the migrants, they may have an email address, but they may not be terribly savvy at actually sending an email, at copying and pasting a template into the email that says, this is my new address. So attorneys are actually going to be utilizing the migrants' phones with them to help them copy and paste into an email add the migrant's current address, and then send that off to ICE so that the migrants both know how to do it in the future, but ICE is receiving that notification directly from the migrants. So again, we'll be using templates and we'll be using an online system and a script to help you through this process. And then the third option for changing your address or the third requirement, I should say, is the USCIS change of address. As Lisa had showed earlier, this is primarily done online. If the migrant lacks an email address, we'll do it by paper. And again, we're always providing a copy of each completed document for the migrants' records. So we have 3 different stations for this because we want to emphasize to the migrants, there's 3 different entities you have to change your address with. It's the immigration court, it's ICE, and it's with USCIS. And so 3 different stations, 3 different places that you need to change your address. And then finally, there's going to be an exit station where somebody is going to review that checklist at the triage station completed, make sure that the migrants have completed all the necessary paperwork to change their addresses with each of the necessary agencies. At the exit station, we'll be able to register certain migrants for the Pro Se Asylum Workshop if they'd like to do so, and make sure the migrants understand all of the paperwork that is going to be in their folder that they're going to take with them, so they know what resources and information they have in the future, so that hopefully they're able to manage some of these steps on their own and have some autonomy and some independence and be empowered to take these steps on their own, even if they don't have an attorney assisting them. At each station, there's a couple of things we just want to, really hammer in the heads of everybody who comes through. There's a lot of information that is being shared with the migrants every single day since the moment they cross the border. Information coming from different agencies, from different social service providers, from different people that they interact with. And we just want to try to get these concepts in their heads to the best they can so that it gets a little bit more attention as they proceed in the process and maybe sticks out a little bit amidst all the other information that they are receiving. So one of which is you're just going to keep reminding them that you are not their attorney. You're assisting them today, but you are not their attorney. If they would like an attorney, they unfortunately will have to find them on their own at this point. We want to remind them of the 3 different places they need to change their address every time they move, with the court, with USCIS, and with ICE. Again, 3 different agencies. We want to emphasize that every time. As Lisa mentioned, we want to remind them again and again, always check that online system or the 1-800 number every 2 weeks in case their court has changed and maybe they didn't update their address in time, or maybe the court unfortunately was using a bad address. We want to make sure that they know the best way to check if they have an upcoming court hearing so they don't miss that hearing and receive an in absentia removal order. We want to remind them again and again that court hearings and ICE check-ins are 2 different things and both must be attended. Attending the ICE check-in is not sufficient to cover the court hearing and vice versa. They need to do both. And then we always want to end any interaction with the migrants by asking, do you understand? And do you have any questions? Again, we understand that this is so much information. It's complicated for attorneys to understand all of these procedural intricacies and different processes that everyone has to go through. And many of the migrants, it's going to be overwhelming. So we want to give them an opportunity to express if they don't understand, if they need something repeated, if they have any questions. And if it's a question that you are not equipped to answer or it's really outside the scope of the clinic, that's okay. There are going to be numerous immigration experts that are going to be at the clinic that can help you out. We're going to have some referral information. So we want to help as much as we can, and also, again, keep managing expectations about the scope of the clinic and what can be accomplished that day. All right, a few final notes, and then we will have you out and on your way. So one thing is working with interpreters. So most of you, unless you are a proficient or fluent Spanish speaker, you will be working with an interpreter at the clinic. It's important to keep in mind that working with an interpreter is a skill, just like any other communication skill. And so it will take a little bit of time to get up to speed. If you haven't worked with an interpreter before, you'll need to gain a little experience as you go along. And again, just be patient and try to keep in mind some of these best practices as you go forward. One is always speak in first person. The interpreter should be speaking in first person, and you should be speaking in first person. So you want to ask your questions directly to the migrant. When you're asking questions, you don't speak in third person. You do not say, please ask her her name. Please ask her where she lives. You want to say, what is your name? Where do you live? Can you tell me your phone number? You want to speak directly, and the interpreter is going to translate in first person as well. That's going to help make very clear to the migrant that you are the attorney, you are the one running this particular station, and also avoid any kind of confusion that could occur or any sort of side conversations that could occur to the detriment of the migrant. You also want to speak in as few sentences at a time and as simply as possible. The interpreter is not going to be able to translate accurately if you speak in a paragraph long narrative. The same goes for the migrant. You really want to avoid legalese for two reasons. It's going to be more difficult to accurately and translate if you're speaking in legal terms and US legal terms. And many of the migrants are not going to understand if you speak in legal terms. So saying things like we talked about in this clinic, being removed in absentia, that's not a concept that many of the migrants are going to understand, and you're going to need to break down that terminology. You'll hear staff at the clinic, explaining things like informed consent in much clearer terms, much simpler terms, so that the migrants understand what that means when they are agreeing and acknowledging that we are not their attorneys at the particular clinic. So break things down, speak as simple as possible, and speak in short sentences. And again, we've said this again and again, we just want to emphasize this is a pilot. So we are assessing every single aspect of this clinic, from timing to flow to structure to resources to this training. We know that unexpected issues are going to arise. We know some migrants may not come with the paperwork that we need to assist them. We know some migrants will maybe have an immediate urgent need that we may try to assist with at that particular time if they have a hearing in a few days in a location other than Chicago. We will have multiple immigration experts and administrative assistants on site to assist with every part of the process. We really appreciate your patience, and we really appreciate your feedback, because again, the goal here is to make this a scalable clinic that can be conducted for potentially hundreds of migrants at a time, because that is what is necessary to meet the needs of the more than 18,000 migrants who have arrived in Chicago over the past year and a half or so. So feedback is incredibly useful. We really look forward to your help and assistance at the clinic, and look for other ideas that you may have to help make this more manageable and more helpful and positive in the future. And with that, we are not quite sure if this training is going to be eligible for CLE credit yet. NIJC will be able to confirm that in the near future. But if you would like to be considered for CLE credit, please use this QR code here in order to get to the training survey that is necessary for the CLE credit. And there was also at the beginning of the PowerPoint, and here again, there's an attendance QR code that is needed in order to get CLE as well. We will be circulating this PowerPoint after to all clinic volunteers, so don't worry about it if you can't utilize it right at this moment. And that is it. So thank you again for participating in this training. We look forward to working with you. And again, we look forward to your feedback and how we can make this better in the future. Thank you.